Hello, I hope you've been enjoying these tales told by David Kossoff and retold by me for Lent and now for Holy Week as the whole mood starts to change in these stories and we get ever nearer to Good Friday and beyond. Today I want to tell you the story as written by David Kossoff of Janus. Janus was an officer who worked alongside Pontius Pilate and played quite a significant part in the ruling and the governorship of Pilate. He's obviously a Roman citizen. So here we go. This is Janus' story. So, Pilate has gone, cold-eyed Pontius, procurator of Judea, roughshod rider extraordinaire, roughshod just once too often, and now is on his way back to Rome. Good riddance, Pilate, with pals in high places, and appointed by Tiberius himself. He's in disgrace, and going back to a dying Tiberius, perhaps already dead, with new faces in high places. Ha! Serves him right. Tiberius's favourite will be nobody's favourite, for that's the way in Rome. I know Rome. I did my military service there and was born just outside to the south. I came here to Jerusalem when Gratus was governor, maybe 15 years ago. He taught me my job. Personal assistant, aide-de-camp, right-hand man, dog's body, beck and call merchant, doormat. You must forgive my rather undiplomatic use of words. 5 days ago, when Pilate sailed away, I retired, and have now not been quite sober since. The feeling of holiday is enormous. Marolus is the new man, and he's bringing his own dog's body. I shall see them in, and that's that. I shall retire to my villa in Galilee. Well, there I shall grow vegetables and fruit. Where I was born, we have a saying, you have to know a man really well to hate him. Well, I knew Pilate very well indeed, and his nature was hateful. He had no friends, not really. 10 years here and 8 people saw him off. I like to leave a few reliable enemies wherever I go, he used to say. Well, he's left more than a few here. I'm not a good hater, but he was. He hated with a sneer and with contempt. He hated Antipas and Caiaphas, the high priest and the high priest's father-in-law, old Janus, who I think was a good match for him. An old fox. Janus, completely unafraid of the splendid chief he was. Pilate hated the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of them. I don't care what their labels are, he'd say. They're Jews, the lot of them. He had absolute contempt for Antipas and all the royal family, and he showed it. Not in a vulgar way. Never, never vulgar, my chief. A raised eyebrow, a curled lip, an expressionless look like ice. I suppose that one of the biggest disturbances in the last 10 years was that business with the carpenter. 6, maybe 7 years ago. Not from Pilate's point of view, he didn't care one way or another, and his killings were usually much bigger affairs, with him on his big white horse and his troops all there with their swords. No, when I say disturbance, I mean the whole city seemed to be in uproar. All the religious parties, the temple lot, the councils, everybody seemed to be involved over a poor preacher from Galilee who it seemed could cure people. If Pilate had kept his temper and used just a little bit of sense, that preacher would have been out of harm's way for a while and the whole thing forgotten. Instead of which, his followers have got a whole movement going, which is totally out of hand. We lock up 10 and 20 more pop up. I often think If the crowd with the preacher had waited till morning and just kept their voices down, we could have got some order into it. They came screaming into the forecourt at dawn, hundreds of them. I swear half of them were a paid mob. Shouters, we used to call them. Oh, we used them ourselves. Confusion makers. Friend, I tell you, that was positively not the way to wake up my late chief. He used to indulge himself in various little ways until the early hours, and normally opened his office at noon. He came into my room white with temper. He looked mad. I dressed and went down, and there the lunacy started. First, the accusers of the prisoners wouldn't come inside because we were a Gentile building, and they didn't want their Passover holiness contaminated. So Pilate went out to them and told them to clear off and judge the fellow themselves. Then the shouters started, wanting a death sentence, which only Pilate could give. So he had the prisoners brought inside and questioned him. But the preacher either wouldn't answer or answered in a way which almost was guaranteed to annoy Pilate. I was doing the charge notes. As far as I could make out, the preacher was accused of misrepresentation, fraud, and blasphemy. He said he was King of the Jews and Son of God. After a few moments, Pilate stopped asking questions. I think he could hardly believe that his sleep had been disturbed by the sort of case that usually was entitled and settled in district court, with the prisoner given a week of cold water immersion, starvation, and a straitjacket. Pilate looked at me. I knew that look. It usually meant some mad private joke was being invented. Jokes in which pain for others always paid a price. Pain, ridicule, sometimes even death. That was his humour, his stimulus, his aphrodisiac. I do not joke. And so it began. First out to the mob, listening with an inclined head and cold eyes to the different party spokesmen. A tall, correct, sharp-nosed Pilate saying, "I see nothing criminal in the prisoner." Then, when told the preacher was from Galilee, sending him over to Antipas, official tetrarch for the Galilee region. Armed guard, all the trimmings. It won't wake Antipas up, Pilate said. He's got cronies in one of his ghastly wife's three-day parties with special entertainers. Well, here's a new one for them. Ha! The Son of God! When the preacher came back from Antipas, he was dressed in a cloak. Obviously some pretty rough fun had been made of him. The mob went crazy, howling for death. Pilate was enjoying it. He made a speech about his custom of always releasing a prisoner at festival time. Anyone, even the carpenter. But the shouters started to scream for a rioter called Barabbas, very popular in the city, to be free and for this preacher to be crucified. "Are you sure?" Pilate kept on saying to them. "Are you sure?" He got them screeching like children at a pantomime. "Are you sure?" A Roman procurator, a governor. It was disgraceful. Then he told the crowd that as crucifixion seemed rather too severe a punishment, he would give the prisoner a sharp lesson. "He will be flogged," he told them. 50 strokes with the Roman scourge whip, right away. The garrison yard is alongside the forecourt, and the whipping could be heard. The mob counted the strokes. Pilate was there watching. He was absolutely relaxed and expressionless. 2 sergeants brought the preacher back. Still in the robe, now with a ring of thorn twigs pushed down on his head, he looked half dead. He couldn't stand up. He was held up. 20 strokes is standard and will take most of the skin off a man's back. Pilate turned his head and raised a hand. "Behold," he said, "the King of the Jews." They screamed like wild animals when they'd smelt blood, and there was plenty to smell. They wanted a death, not a whipping. Pilate got up and told the sergeants to bring the preacher inside again for further interrogation. He said over his shoulder to the spokesman, I think he was curious, as I was, to find out what it was that had caused rather a mild man to stir up such a riot. But he discovered very little. The preacher was conscious, but obviously badly hurt. He was calm. He showed neither fear nor anger. Pilate asked him certain questions, but he gave no reply at all, just a calm, almost thoughtful gaze. Pilate went closer. He was angry, a kind of cold anger of his own kind. "Don't you realize," he said, "that whether you live or you die is entirely in my hands?" And then the preacher spoke. "You have no power over me at all," he said, "except that allowed you by God my Father. Indeed, in this matter, you are guilty of little. You only do as he tells you." It was said so quietly, from a bruised mouth in a dead white face. And Pilate, he was speechless. I could see why. It was almost funny, unique. Here was a prisoner judging him. A prisoner flogged nearly to death, covered in blood, in gory fancy dress of kingly robe and crown, assessing Pilate's guilt. And worse, here was the pawn in the game, the middle of the joke, seemingly the least disturbed of all, and the only one showing any sign of dignity. Pilate said no more. To match the dignity, to show his own, he sent for the silver basin, the abstaining bowl, warm water. We went out and the crowd went quiet. Something new for them to see. I held the bowl, and Pilate, facing the priest, said in his formal voice, "The charge is not proven. I wash my hands of this matter," and dipped his fingers with a sideways look at me. Then it went bad. The old fox, Janus, stepped forward. The mob, which had begun to go mad again, stopped. "In this country," said the old man, "we have no kings anymore. We have tetrarchs and princes and procurators put here by our rulers Rome. We do have a king, an emperor. The accused says he is our king, enthroned by his Father Almighty God, thus greater even than the emperor, than Caesar. If you release this man," said the old fox, "it would seem you agree. It would seem you are no friend of Caesar." It went dead quiet. Pilate was now in the middle of the joke. It had blown up in his face. He had lost command, and the mob knew it. Mobs always know. And Pilate knew, as I did, that the old man had power and could send a report to Rome. Using that reasoning, it could make a lot of trouble. The hand-washing could be seen as both incompetent and disloyal. Both serious matters. It was very quiet. The old man was absolutely unaffected by the hatred pouring out of Pilate, who tried to match the cunning of the old king. "Am I to kill your king?" he said to the old man. "We have no king but Caesar," said the old man, without even blinking. And that was that. Pilate walked across to the raised dais in the forecourt called the Pavement. He sat down on the small throne where judgments and sentences are given. He formally found the prisoner guilty and sentenced him to be crucified. He used all the correct words, put his seal on the order, stood up and walked past me without a word. I didn't go to the crucifixion. If you've seen one, you've seen them all. And the carpenter, well, he wasn't the first. And I knew he wouldn't be the last either.